I'm really quite shocked about Zelensky, and I'm also amazed at how polite President Trump is being. He's been remarkably polite. The truth is, Zelensky's no longer relevant. He needs to shut up and get off the stage as quickly as possible. The longer he stays there, the higher the probability that he doesn't live long. He needs to understand that. He needs to stop listening to the British and the French, who are feeding him a lot of nonsense that have no chance whatsoever of helping him, especially that principal clown in the European circus, Boris Johnson, who is recently in Kiev again. Bojo from London isn't, and Macron in Paris is almost as irrelevant as Zelensky. It's unfortunate that we say that, but truthfully it is. He could have been much more relevant if he had taken a more strident position earlier against the stupidity, but he refuses to do that. So Trump is going to do whatever President Trump wants to do. And President Trump is not an enemy of Ukraine by any means, but he wants peace and stability in Europe, and he's going to deliver it. And I think Putin is going to help him deliver that. So I think at this stage of the game, Zelensky's irrelevant. It doesn't matter what he says or does. And the British and the French need to go home. And they need to tell their troops to stand down. They're not going anywhere. No one wants them anywhere, least of all the Russians in Ukraine. It's getting to the point where if you have nothing to put on the table, then shut up and get out. So I think this war will end when the Russians content and satisfied with what they've accomplished. I think those things will happen. It will all end. But the British and the French are living in a dream world. They're behaving as though they are great powers. They really aren't. They're middleweight powers at this point. They don't have much in the way of armed forces. That's not our fault. That's theirs. And they need to understand that. Once again, that's not President Trump's fault. That tragic outcome is a consequence of President Biden and these globalist fools that are still in power in places like Paris and London, and for that matter, even still in Berlin. And of course, Mark Rutte really needs to consider resigning. And if he feels very strongly about what he said, he should volunteer his services, get on a uniform, pick up a weapon, fly to Kiev, and offer his services in the front lines. I don't see that happening, but that's what he ought to do, because what he's just said is just pure, unadulterated nonsense.
By the way, Trump has also said some great things about China recently. He said he wants to disengage our naval forces from the South China Sea. He's sending signals about withdrawing forces from Northeast Asia. He wants to disengage most of our forces from Europe, not because he wants to abandon Europe. He would like to sit back and support Europe as Europe sorts itself out. That, to me, is a breath of fresh air, because we've had for 50, 60 years nothing but four-star Army and Air Force generals trying to tell the Europeans how to do everything, or various secretary generals who've been pathetic puppets of Washington. He's saying, let's end that. I mean, that's where we're headed. I think it's all good. It's how it's packaged and presented that makes a big difference. And I don't think we've packaged it all that well. But in our system, the people that donate huge quantities of money have to be adhered to some extent. You have to grant them their wishes. And he's had a lot of people who've demanded from him that Israel have a free hand, not only in Gaza, but to annex the West Bank. And the Israelis are now pursuing that. And if you look at the patches that they're wearing on their arms in the IDF, it shows you this Greater Israel Project. And that controls everything from southern Syria all the way to the west bank of the Nile River and all of Sinai and so forth. Well, that presumes, Neil, that he had the opportunity to pick those people without interference from outside actors. In other words, he has donors, people that donated enormous quantities of money that were instrumental in putting him in the White House. He has to deal with them. He brought in John Bolton as a national security advisor, and I know that he didn't want the man, but he received a call from Sheldon Adelson, who was his biggest donor at the time, and said, please, 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 won't you talk to John Bolton? I know he'll do a good job for you. And finally, he relented and met with the man. It was an unhappy marriage from day one. He never liked it at all. I don't know how much he can obstruct that. Now, Israel on its own can't do anything. Let's be frank. The only reason they can do what they do is because of our unconditional support. And they know that. And they've never had it so good. Will that continue, or will he finally say, wait a minute, this is too much? Other presidents have always stood up and said, stop. There have to be limits to how far you go and what you do. That hasn't happened. And I don't know if it will happen. I can't predict that. I just don't know. I only know the man Trump. I regard him as innately good, but I am disappointed in some of these transactional attitudes, particularly the callous disregard for life in Gaza and potentially elsewhere. If you want to do business with me and you bring me a bag of money, then I'll consider your request. This kind of thing disturbs me greatly. It can't go on like that, and we can't survive as a great power with that philosophical approach. And as I said again, if Donald Trump can act on his instincts, everything will be fine. And right now, I don't know if you saw it recently, but President Erdogan was talking to an audience of young Turks, and they began chanting, "Take us to Jerusalem, take us to Jerusalem, take us to Jerusalem." Remember that the Turkish Sultan, was the first Khalifa of Islam, and the holy city and all of the sites there were under his protection. You've had statements coming out of Israel suggesting that the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which marks the place or commemorates the place from which the prophet's soul ascended into heaven, should be destroyed so that this new temple can be built. This is, I'm not involved with this. It's not my way of looking at the world. But in that part of the world, that's incendiary. And the Turks in particular are opposed to it. And finally, to get them to stop, he motioned, please stop. And then he said, patience will deliver victory. And this is another challenge for us in the United States, because we have seen ourselves as the principal driver of events and activities. Remember this stupid remark, we're the indispensable superpower. In reality, we don't need to be involved in very much at all. And I think that's something that Mr. Trump understands. But in the Middle East in particular, the Turks are a great people. They have a very martial culture. There are somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 plus million of them. They have a very large population under the age of 30. They can field powerful forces. Erdogan is nothing if not crafty and smart. I don't know how much longer he's going to be there. One of his likely successors is the foreign minister, Fidan. He's a very smart man. But the population is ready to act. That is nothing if not dangerous. The Arabs are worried about it. The Jordanians, the Egyptians, the Saudis, they are very worried about it. They all lived under Ottoman rule, and they had mixed experiences. So they're not especially happy about it, but increasingly, they are beginning to say, who else can lead us? Who else can save us? Who else can help us defeat this monster that has grown in Israel? And that's very dangerous. The other thing that I find kind of interesting with Mr. Starmer is that many, many years ago, back in the 1870s, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck was asked by a British journalist, what would you do if the British Army landed on the North Sea coast of Germany? And he said, well, that's simple. I'd have it arrested. And of course, his point was that the British Army was so small, it posed no real threat. Britain had a great navy, and that obviously could be threatening, especially if they were blockaded, which Bismarck understood. But I think, unfortunately, at this stage of the game, the British Army is emasculated to the point where no one takes it seriously. Starmer, I think, has embarrassed himself. And I'm sure Mr. Trump knows that. But the principal ice that's being broken is this hostility between Russia and the United States. For that, I think we should all be grateful. And from this point forward, we can move into a whole number of areas, not just resolving this tragedy on the ground in Ukraine, which frankly should never have happened. That's going to be resolved. But also we can get back to some useful discussions on nuclear weapons and nuclear capabilities. And I think Mr. Trump has already hinted at that. So all in all, this is good news. The question for President Trump is, how do you move ahead with the Europeans? I think that Mr. Trump has been subject to insults and offensive remarks, and I'm sure that continues to grate on him. But he does know that Europe has to play a role. How that's going to unfold, how that will be done is right now unanswered. You can't have a new security architecture in Europe that involves Russia and the United States unless the Europeans are involved. Now, I'm sure that there's an expectation that many of the people currently in power in Europe and in the United Kingdom will be gone shortly, that there will be elections and new people will be swept into power. Now, I don't know if that's necessarily anticipated in Great Britain, but it certainly is in Germany and I suspect France and other countries. They are almost always nationalists, or certainly more nationalist in their thinking, which is not aggressive and offensive. It's a kind of nationalism that says we want to preserve our country. We want our own culture, our identity, our language. Those things need to be protected, and we want peace abroad. In other words, prosperity at home and peace abroad, which I think we all support. I certainly do, and I know the Russians do. That will work itself out.
I think that anybody that you boot out at this point is a good decision. You know, we're at the end of a long period of what I would call core rot in the Department of Defense. We've got large numbers of people at the top who have no business being there. They should never have been promoted to the ranks that they hold. The steady deterioration from excellence to mediocrity that I've been watching over the last 30 years is just astounding. And we have clearly bottomed out. So whatever Secretary Hegseth wants to change is good. I'm 100% behind it. The one criticism I would level is this. We don't want to rebuild anything, Dan. We want to build a new force. This is a strategic inflection point in the history of the United States. This is a time where we need to bring the forces back and we need to retread, reorganize, retrench. That means organize for a different war in the future and pay attention to our security here at home, principally the border with Mexico, but not just that, the borders, the coastal waters. You know, it's back to bring the Coast Guard back from the South China Sea. Ridiculous. Bring the Coast Guard back from the Indian Ocean. Ridiculous. Get focused on what really counts, and that's defense of our homeland. That has been ignored for far too long. You know, one of the things that Secretary Hegseth and the new Secretary of the Navy ought to do is bring in a snapshot from the satellites regarding where all the ships at sea are in the United States Navy, surface vessels and submarines. They can do that. And then look at what the picture was 30 years ago. And I've actually participated in this, and I can tell you that picture hasn't changed much. And the real question is why? You know, I listened to someone today that said, we have to build a much bigger Navy. Really? Is that the answer? A bigger version of what we have? We're not about to fight Jutland. We're not about to fight Midway. This is a new world. Are these big surface capital ships really what we want for the future? I don't think so. It's as dumb as the idea that we ought to organize the army to deploy to the Eurasian continent and fight against the Russians or the Chinese or somebody else. That's crazy. Those days are over. We're never going to get across those oceans. The submarines will sink us. Missiles will sink us. We don't have to have surface vessels all over the world because we have satellite-based surveillance, reconnaissance, intelligence. We can find things out, but build a new force, and that can be done. Stop clinging tenaciously to the past. You know, there's this old expression from Peter Drucker. He said, people will always cling to the past and to the obsolete. They will never willingly march forward and adopt something new. The only way to get rid of the obsolete is to stop doing what you're doing. And there are lots of people in the Army that understand that. We're not going to refight the Second World War. We don't want to. And if we try to do it, particularly against the Russians, we'll be annihilated. You know, if you look at the density of force that was on the ground during World War II as it faced against the Germans, if we try to do that again, we'll stand by and watch rocket artillery, medium-range ballistic missiles, glide bombs, you name it, fly in and obliterate everything. What are we doing? Cutting squares in the ocean, in the Indian Ocean, waiting for what? It doesn't make any sense. We've got to sit down and take an honest look at ourselves. You know, the Marines have tried to do this. I think the outcome's been a disaster because there's also a tendency to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Oh, we don't need any more of X. No, that's not necessarily true. We may not need as many of X. We may need fewer, but we're still going to need a lot of X. And, the Marine Corps, the heart of the Marine Corps, the backbone is the infantry. We need the infantry. That infantry needs to be part of the larger ground force. It is in France. It is in Great Britain. It's vital and essential that we have access to Marine infantry to cooperate with us, not be treated as a second army, but be seen as an integral part of the larger ground force that can perform that infantry mission. Now, that may involve a new organization, new kinds of capabilities, weapon systems. We can sort through that. But you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, well, we don't need that anymore, or we're going to turn everybody into a rocketeer. We have lots of platforms, undersea, submersible, surface, and airborne, as well as ground-based, that can deliver missiles. We don't necessarily have to have large numbers of Marines spread out all over the Pacific Ocean, waiting for the evil Chinese empire to strike west. I mean, this is just crazy. The point is, nothing's going to happen until the Russians are confident and comfortable with the outcome on the ground. They're not there yet. They're not comfortable with the denazification. They're not comfortable with a number of these conditions. Again, that's why it's so important to get control of Ukraine, of the Kiev government. The best thing we can do is to send Mr. Zelensky and his little inner circle away. I don't know if they want to bring back Zelensky, who's the former general that's currently sitting as ambassador in London. I don't know what they want to do, or whomever else they can find. But it needs to end, and it's not going to end with the people that are sitting in Kiev. They've got to go away. The Ukrainian armed forces must be destroyed. And that's what's happening. The last remnants of it are being destroyed. And then finally, they need a new government in Kiev. I wouldn't trust Zelensky and his little group any further than I could throw a grand piano. Why would the Russians? I mean, why would the Russians trust anybody, including us, given the way we've lied to them repeatedly, given what we heard about the Minsk Accords, thanks to Merkel, who opened her mouth and told the truth for a change. This sort of thing, we've got to come to terms with reality. This is about Russian national security. They have legitimate national security interests in Ukraine. They always have. We have legitimate national security interests in Mexico. And we're going to see those interests come into play in the future pretty quickly. And it'll be interesting to see how we react. I think we will react much as the Russians did towards Ukraine. And President Trump exerts enormous power in that regard. He can help remove these people and get them out of the picture. And then he can probably realize his aims much more quickly, because that would demonstrate conclusively to the Russians that we're serious. We're the ones who have run the show there. We're the ones that brought on this war. Remember that. And the Russians know it. And so they're watching to see what we do. Talk is cheap. Action is everything. One of the things that could have been done that wasn't, and by the way, I understand how President Trump feels. You have to remember that when he was president during the first term, he was not treated well by the Europeans. And I think that there's a lingering sense of hurt and anger over that. And I wouldn't be surprised about it, especially when you look at this man Starmer, and to a lesser extent at the French government. At this point, the Europeans, instead of seeing which way the wind is blowing and understanding that this war is going to end, and it's not going to end the way they want it to, it's going to end the way Moscow wants to end it. And we're prepared to accept that because, after all, they live there. Eastern Ukraine is next door. We don't. And we respect their wishes. I mean, that's really what President Trump has signaled. President Trump has a lot of influence. And I don't want to go into detail, but he can make it very clear what we will not do in the future if they do not cease and desist. Now, it would have been nice had the delegation that we sent to Saudi Arabia essentially decamped and went to Berlin, Paris, and London to address the Europeans in those governments directly and say, this is what we've discussed. This is what we have agreed to in principle. And this is what we're going to do next. That would have been helpful. We really didn't do that. And I understand why. And if the Europeans aren't going to get on board, there are a lot of things that can be done immediately behind the scenes that could be, let us say, detrimental to the political careers of the people that are currently sitting in power in these capital cities. And President Trump knows that. And it's up to him whether or not he feels that he's got to do that to make his influence felt. Remember, Eisenhower had a disagreement with the British and the French and the Israelis in 1956. He made his influence felt, and everyone withdrew and got on side. We're still, vis-a-vis Europe, that powerful, and they know that. And it's in their interest to work with us, not against us. So Rutte needs to go. He should resign. And so should these people in London and Paris if they're not going to do what's in the best interest of their country. Again, all you have to do is look at the opinion polls. Remember that Vice President Vance made the issue. They're acting against the will of their people. He's absolutely right. The opinion polls are obvious. There's no one chomping at the bit in Northumberland or Wales or Cheshire, can't wait to get on the airplane, put on a uniform, and fly to Ukraine. I don't see anybody in Provence or the Vendée or anywhere in France that wants to do it either. So it's time to stop the nonsense. It's time to get back to business. And after all, rebuild the economies, which are now shattered as a result of these stupid policies. It's not the Russians that are standing in the way of that. They are standing in the way of it themselves. I think the Russians in particular, at this point in time, are not interested in nonsense. They're not going to take any sort of strategic hedge that President Trump or anyone else thinks they're creating seriously. They want an end to this. They're willing to sign an agreement with us. They're interested in a security architecture for Europe, Russia, and the United States. We need to take that very seriously. This should be seen as a strategic inflection point in the history of Europe and, frankly, the world. And we should treat it appropriately, very seriously. Sit down and work it out, however many months it takes, because this could set the stage for decades of prosperity and peace and stability. That is what everyone should now be interested in. Russia is interested in it. I think we are as well. All this sort of tactical nonsense or mispronouncements all needs to go away. In fact, frankly, Judge, there are too many people in this administration talking too much about everything. So the only answer I could give you is that I don't know, but this is another example of something that happened to him during his first term. He would issue an order, he would give direction, but then there was no follow-up to ensure that his orders and directives were obeyed. That may well be the case now. And of course, Secretary Hegseth is new to the Defense Department. He may be in a somewhat similar situation. I don't know. He would provide more aid if they provided mineral wealth to the United States in some substantial form. Again, it makes no sense. All of the aid should stop immediately. Not humanitarian aid, but certainly any form of military aid should stop immediately. Why would the Russians take us seriously for a second if we sustained it? We need less of this marketing ploy, less nonsense, and more facts. And those facts should come from the president and not from anybody else. And they should come, I would say, only when absolutely necessary and carefully constructed after much research and understanding. That obviously is not the case.
Well, President Trump has recognized that President Xi in China and President Putin in Russia are now people that have a stake in the international system, and we need to work with them. I think he understands that. That's a very, very important development. I mean, we suffer from, inside the Beltway at any rate, a terminal case of national narcissism. We think we're the center of the universe. I think President Trump knows that's not true. All you have to do is look at the trade imbalances and the new trade routes that are populated with goods and services. Just what it was in 2000 is not at all what it is today. It's radically different. The big engine of economic growth and prosperity for the world is China. And that's the truth. And that's not a danger to us. It's real. And even though I know that if Mr. Trump had his way, he would hammer out an agreement with Iran. There's no doubt in my mind. I know him. He's always been anti-war. He understands war destroys presidencies. I just don't know that he's a free agent. And that has to do with other people in Washington, in the government, in the financial system, who want something else. So we'll have to see. So I think he understands that. Now you're asking about the Middle East. That's a different animal for him. And it's hard for me to know. I heard somebody say, well, now everything's coming up roses in the Middle East. There will be no more bombing of Gaza. There will be a peace agreement with Iran. Well, I'm sure that those are things that President Trump would welcome, but he can't make that happen. That's probably going to trigger a regional war. We already see that in Egypt. Egypt is explosive. Jordan is explosive. And then even Turkey, which has been very opportunistic lately in terms of willing to cooperate if it advanced their interests, as in Syria, may turn around and say they can't tolerate that. The same thing is true in Iran. Mr. Netanyahu has his own agenda, and he has enormous support inside the United States. I fear that not long from now, by the end of the month, Gaza will blow up again. That the Israelis are going to go in and do what they keep talking about, which is, quote unquote, finish the job.
So there are some success stories, but in recent times, I don't think so. So, it would have made more sense if you really want fresh eyes, a new way to look at things, to reach much lower. That's what FDR did with Marshall. Marshall was a one-star general, and he reached down and elevated this man. It had a huge impact. It helped to retire lots of people. It was a complete turnover in the Army in terms of its mentality, thinking, and outlook, even though Marshall and FDR were frequently of a different opinion. And Marshall was also a Republican. It worked out very well because Marshall, like MacArthur, was ultimately loyal to the President of the United States, who was the commander-in-chief. The last time that we had someone who came out of retirement, well, there are two examples, good ones that I can think of. One is Admiral Leahy, who had been chief of naval operations, and he was de facto the senior military advisor to FDR. I think he did a splendid job, and he was effectively the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who gave directions to Marshall and King, the two four-stars, one Navy, one Army, and then, of course, Arnold. The only other one who was a success story is MacArthur. MacArthur was retired. He was in retirement. He was a major general, because once you retired as a four-star before World War II, you reverted to two-star rank. He was then restored to his four stars and put in command of the Philippines. And at the time, FDR wasn't very comfortable with him because he was a known Republican and right-winger. But MacArthur seems to have gotten along with FDR and done effectively whatever FDR wanted operationally. So there's good reason to send them away. We need new, fresh eyes to look at a new world, new situations, new technologies, and frankly, to build new armed forces, not rebuild the old ones. I mean, the biggest mistake we can make at this point is rebuild the old force. The old force is the wrong force. We need to build a new one. So putting new officers in there is important for that reason, as well as the political reason that why would you want someone serving under you who's supposed to obey your orders, who is ostensibly opposed to you fundamentally, viscerally in their thinking? It's catastrophic. First of all of these senior officers have come up through the ranks, certainly from the mid-90s until now. That was a very different atmosphere in professional terms from what existed before 1991. Now, I'm not saying that all the senior officers today are much worse or less capable or less competent than the officers that existed before 1991, but I don't think there was any highly politicized faction of any kind inside the senior ranks of the armed forces before Desert Storm. That changes in the 1990s because the Clinton administration and subsequently the George W. Bush administration, which was really in most cases an extension of what happened under Clinton, and then Obama, who was really an extension of what was going on under Bush, positioned officers who were user-friendly to the political regimes. And that meant that they were going to support and implement policies which, frankly, most of the officers that were there before 1991 would have viewed as antithetical to the interests of good discipline, cohesion, and effectiveness. Remember, the mission statement that describes the chairman of the Joint Chiefs' true role in all of these matters is as the senior military advisor to the president. The chairman has no real command authority of any kind. The command authority reaches from the president and the secretary of defense down to the regional unified commanders or the functional and unified commanders. It does not go through the service chiefs. Service chiefs are literally a committee of men and women who are part of the advisory staff for the chairman. They have very limited authority when it comes to operations. Unfortunately, most of the chairmen through most of our history have been very unimpressive men, people that were likely to be user-friendly in the wrong way. We haven't had very many who stood up and said, don't do X, it's a bad idea. Very few have done that. So none of these people are in the operational chain of command, but they control most of the money. And when you control most of the money, you control most of the decisions. So changing them for that reason also makes sense. But in the case of the chairman, he's someone who has to be able to speak truth to power. He has to have backbone. He can't just be a yes man.